Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's talk, Introducing Quentin Mestiz, A Closer Look. My name is Greg Sandoval. I'm from the Getty Museum Public Programs team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk with curator Anne Ouellette. This lecture complements the recent acquisition of Mestiz's Madonna of the Cherries. So this will be a close look at that particular painting, which is currently on view here at the Getty Center in the North Pavilion on the second floor. So after today's talk, if you have not seen the painting, you can go upstairs and see it, or you can come back and visit it in our permanent collection galleries for the next several months. As we get started, just a quick few notes. For guests here in the lecture hall, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. For our online attendees, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, press the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of the screen. And following Anne's remarks, we will be able to take questions. So for people online, please use the Q&A function to drop your question in that box, and we will get a chance to share that to Anne on microphone. And for people here in the audience, we will have a mic being walked up and down the aisles, so please take a moment to get someone's attention so everybody can hear your question or comment. Now I'd like to introduce today's lecturer. Curator Anne Ouellette received her master's from the Courtauld Institute of Art and PhD from Columbia University. She joined the Getty Museum's Department of Paintings in 1998 and specializes in Flemish, Dutch, German painting before 1800. Anne's research interests includes the work of Rubens and Rembrandt, collaboration in painting, collecting Netherlandish art in the Western United States, corporate devotional practice, and technical studies of art. Please join me in welcoming Anne to the stage.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'd also like to thank Greg and his team. Thank you for the introduction, Greg, and for very appropriately color coding some of our slides that you've seen with the land acknowledgement, and also for this lecture. That kind of pinky red color is known in French as cerise, which means cherries. So I feel we are very much attuned to our topic today. So we are going to take the opportunity to become better acquainted with Quentin Mestiz, one of the most important Flemish Renaissance painters. He's also a painter known by many forms of his name, so I won't traumatize you by using all of these. The Getty spelling and that of many of our peer institutions is the top form, but the Y actually reflects the kind of combination of IJ in the Flemish language, but we use Y now in the modern spelling. Although generally less well known outside the Netherlands, Mestiz is now very well represented in Southern California. The Getty acquired two compelling paintings by the artist in the last 7 years. Here we see the intense Christ as the Man of Sorrows, acquired in 2018, a previously unknown work discovered in a princely German collection. The Madonna of the Cherries, one of the artist's most celebrated works, believed lost, and known only through other versions made with studio assistants. It was recently recognized and accepted as the one, and it was acquired by the Getty at auction last summer in London. This work is our focus today, and I'll explain why it's the one. Both of these paintings by Mestiz are on view now, as Greg noted, in the North Pavilion, Gallery 202. In the Madonna of the Cherries, the Virgin Mary and Christ Child embrace while seated on a magnificent marble throne embellished with gold tracery, gemstones, and pearls. The Virgin delicately flourishes a branch of bright red cherries between the pinched fingers of her right hand. Cherries have a celestial connotation as the fruit of heaven, while their red color symbolizes the future blood of Christ's passion and sacrifice on the cross. Seen in three-quarter length, she wears a square-necked Renaissance-style gown in a radiant pinkish purple, tied it with a blue-green sash at the waist and enveloped by a rich red mantle. While the ornamented setting attests to her sacred rank, she wears a diaphanous veil instead of a crown as a manifestation of her earthly splendor. The deep purple velvet cushion with elaborate gold tassels upon which Christ sits further underscores the regality of the theme. In the foreground, on a modest wooden shelf, lies a still life of fruit, an apple on the left and grapes on the right. A tall window provides a view over a lush green landscape with a large complex of stone buildings beside a lake. This beautiful and very stylish devotional painting combines brilliant coloristic effects, refined detail, and at the center, a moving representation of holy figures, mother and son. Today, we will consider this painting in the context of the artist's career and the city in which it was painted, Antwerp. Rather exceptionally, this work sheds light on the fame and legacy of Quentin Matsys because of the esteem in which he and the Madonna of the Cherries was held by painters and connoisseurs a century later. It is remarkable to be able to share this phenomena with you visually. Scholars working on later periods are often able to draw on contemporary visual materials, including photographs. For Quentin Matsys, the leading 17th century painters, Peter Paul Rubens and Antony van Dyck, along with perhaps a new painter to this audience, Willem van Hacht, will be our guides to the reception of his work in the 17th century. Finally, in closing, we will dwell briefly on the later history of the painting, leading up to its ecstatic embrace as the long-lost Madonna of the Cherries. The Madonna of the Cherries is a mature work by Quentin Matsys, dating from the last decade of his life. Matsys was born in the university town of Leuven in southeastern Belgium now, in about 1466, the second of four children. He was the son of a blacksmith, a man also identified as a locksmith and a watchmaker, who created intricate and special metalwork for the new city hall in Leuven. Quentin's early activities are not known, that is, in terms of documentation. We don't know, for example, with whom he trained as a painter in Leuven. It was probably not Dirk Bouts, the most important painter in Leuven during the 15th century, who died when Matsys was only 9 in 1475. However, Bouts, whose innovative art combined expressive emotion with precise, refined brushwork, was a crucial source of inspiration for Matsys, as we shall see. Possibly, Quentin trained with his blacksmith father. The earliest biography by Dominicus Lampsonius in 1572, Pictorium aliquo celebrium Germaniae Ferioris Effigius, provides an intriguing story of transformation that became the defining legend for the artist. This author, and also the later biographer Karel van Mander, writing in 1604, were already looking back to an ideal time in the region and the city of Antwerp, from a period of turmoil, looking back to a period of foundation and promise for painting in the region, specifically the metropolis of Antwerp, where Matsys had established himself and elevated the practice of painting. The biography in 1572 suggests an unusual early training, perhaps even a sort of double kind of artistic skill, but also discovery of an innate talent, a talent for painting that came about through the transformative power of love. Translated, Lampsonius's poem accompanying this portrait reads, "Before I used to be a cyclopean smith, but when a wooing painter, that is a competing painter, began to love on an equal footing with me, and the cautious girl objected to me that she liked the heavy thundering of hammers less than the silent paintbrush, love made me a painter. A tiny hammer, which is the sure note of my paintings, alludes to this. Thus, when Venus had asked Vulcan for arms for her son, you, greatest of poets, made a painter out of a smith." So this is a really fun legend that has a long association with Quentin Metsys, and we don't really have any sure information that he was in fact a blacksmith. But this beautiful late Gothic well cover that you see here I made a personal photo in December, so you can see the weather in Antwerp then, has always been considered the handwork of Quentin Metsys. It's currently located outside the Church of Our Lady in Antwerp, the cathedral, where it was moved in around 1550. It's crowned by Silvius Brabo, dressed as a Roman warrior at the top, a character closely associated with Antwerp. And the base, which was created in 1940, bears the inscription, "This ironwork was forged by Quentin Metsys. Love made a painter of this ironsmith." In 1491, Metsys arrived in Antwerp, and he joined the Guild of St. Luke, the Painters' Guild, as a master painter. In the register, he's called Quentin Metsys. And so this means probably that he trained elsewhere, since he's registering as a full master. He arrived in the city at an opportune moment. Antwerp was a vibrant port city on the River Scheldt and the starting point for overland trade routes to other major cities in Europe. Following decades of growth over the 15th century, by about 1500 and then continuing into the 1520s, Antwerp became a powerhouse marketplace and the commercial and financial capital of the European world economy. The basis for its economic might lay in its biennial fairs, which lasted 6 weeks. These were free markets for merchants and regional craftsmen. The scale of these fairs was already tremendous by 1480. Wool and other materials were traded in Antwerp, but above all, the city offered a vigorous market for the sale of luxury goods. That meant paintings, metalwork, polychrome sculptures, altarpieces, tapestries, etc. Many nations were represented with communities in this international port, especially Italian merchants from cities of Genoa, Lucca, Florence, and Venice. The Portuguese made Antwerp the center of the distribution of spices. The great German banking families, the Fugger and the Welser, were established there from 1508. Spanish merchants and those from the Hanseatic League attended the fairs. There were also numerous corporate entities which were visible in processions and other festivities. These are anything that were kind of constituted a group, so craft guilds, the guilds of the armed, or so-called militia guilds. And the city was also dotted with numerous churches and monastic communities. The patron saint of Antwerp was the Virgin Mary, and it was to her that the city's largest church, the Onze Lieve Vrouwkerk, was dedicated. You see that here. Located near the River Scheldt with its towers, it loomed above the city as suggested by this view. More modern view. This gives you a sense of the scale of this enormous building. I'll show you a ground plan in a minute. Entrances on this side. And this I took recently actually because they now illuminate it with this beautiful lighting system that sort of makes it look like it's made of gold, which I thought was very appropriate for its Gothic architecture. So the new church that was dedicated to the Virgin was begun in 1352, and it progressed through the 15th century until its completion to a certain point in 1521. It was enlarged, and other things happened in the early 17th century as well. In its scale, Onze Lieve Vrouw resembled a cathedral, and in fact it became a cathedral in 1559. It also was the largest Gothic church in the Netherlands. The illustrious German painter and scholar Albrecht Dürer visited the Netherlands in 1520-21 and spent time in Antwerp, wrote, quote, "The Church of Our Lady at Antwerp is so very large that many masses are sung in it at one time without interfering with each other. The altars have wealthy endowments, and the best musicians are employed that can be had." So this gives you just a sense of the layout of this church, and I'm showing it to you just to give you a sense of the complexity and scale on the inside. Each one of these little things is a column, so we have the main nave and then the side aisles. and there's an altar against each one. These altars would have been decorated by the individual corporations, guilds, who were the patrons. As I mentioned, the sale of luxury goods took place at these biennial fairs, and generally works in the same medium, so paintings or sculpture were sold together in the same parts of the city. However, in 1460, the Church of Our Lady itself opened something called Our Lady's Pant, Onze Lieve Vrouwe Pant, which remained in operation until 1560. So it's located on church property, which is south of the churchyard, abutting the St. Jan's Canal. So I'm just showing you here. So here is the Church of Our Lady. This is the churchyard, so cemetery. It's now a kind of rather dry public space with a parking garage underneath. But across the road here, this is the pont that I'm talking about, this market area, and it included some adjoining buildings. It was the first purpose-built edifice for the sale of art and for exhibitions and sales in Europe. Generally speaking, these ponts also took place in monastic cloisters or arcaded courtyards with galleries. And Our Lady's Pont generated significant revenue for the church by the first decade of the 15th century. Paintings were sold there, as well as altarpieces, tabernacles, and carvings. Painters in this period sold their works, generally speaking, from their own ateliers. They generally didn't work on commission, with the exception of certain large altarpieces and some portraits. So a pont would have provided a chance for visibility and competition. And so while we have records for the income that was generated by Our Lady's Pont, other practical aspects that we would love to know about are not clear. So how works of art were displayed there, and whether you had your own little zone, or how that worked is not known. This pont was also probably an art supply center. The Joiners Guild, the Schrijnwerkers, oversaw the production of oak panels that painters used as their supports for their paintings, like the Madonna of the Cherries. The Guild also made the casements for the wood-sculpted altarpieces and sold their goods as well. Not surprisingly, this wealthy merchant city attracted artists, and by the early 16th century, it had supplanted Bruges as an artistic center. Painters from Bruges as well as Brussels were participating in the Pont in Antwerp. And while the city was a center of a luxury trade, we know rather little about the painters active there in the 15th century, that is before Quentin Metsys arrives. The Guild Register provides us with names, but we don't necessarily have works that go with those individuals. Metsys had arrived a decade after the Antwerp and the Brussels Painters Guilds together had signed a rental agreement and transferred their sales to this pont, the Onze Lieve Vrouwe Pont. And they did so at a time when the need for paintings was growing among private and corporate patrons. We know from the Guild registers that Metsys accepted apprentices in several years, 1495, 1501, 1504, and 1510. One of Metsys's earliest dated paintings is actually located, relatively speaking, nearby in Fort Worth. It was completed 8 years after he arrived in Antwerp. This is a sensitive portrait of Jacob Albrecht, the celebrated Flemish composer and cleric. Albrecht was the choir master of the Church of Our Lady until 1497. Metsys was already extremely skilled, as you can see here, at the rendering of skin and the delicate textiles, such as the surplice with its lace trim, and the plush gray fur of his almus, which is the garment draped over his arm that indicated his rank, or his office as canon. This painting, this wonderful portrait, may have been the left side of a diptych, so this is a two-part ensemble, with the other side depicting an image of the Virgin. So Metsys's earliest documented altarpiece was painted for the Joiners Guild, the Schrijnwerkers I just mentioned. It was commissioned 1508 for the Church of Our Lady and their altar there. In the center, we see the Lamentation over the Dead Christ. On the wing nearest to me, Salome presents the head of St. John the Baptist to Herod, and on the right, the far side, the martyrdom of St. John the Baptist. This is a huge, I have to say, truly huge painting. It's extremely dynamic, very intense, dramatic, powerful emotion, and one in which we really see landscape emerge as a character in the drama of the individual scenes. I had the opportunity to see it while it was being cleaned recently, so I got up close and I had a couple of details to show. They're all from the central panel. So we see the head of Christ here with this extremely gruesome kind of plucking of thorns from his head. This is the kind of intense sort of realism that Metzius would have maybe taken from his forebear Dirk Bouts in Leuven. That's kind of relentless way of helping a viewer kind of respond to the Passion of Christ. The emotion that had to, of course, transmit across a kind of large space within the cathedral is very beautifully conveyed through other aspects of the altarpiece. This is the head of the Virgin with her copious tears and very mournful expression. And we already see in this painting Metzius' real interest in color and in patterning here. And he was an artist who was extremely fond of these delicate, difficult to name violets and sort of pale purples and things that sort of combine these pinks and blues together in a really sort of luminous hue. So Metzius' output during this first 2 decades of the 16th century really reveals his versatility and ingenuity. I thought I would very briefly show you some other paintings to give you a sense of the range. It's a little bit unfair because each one, I think, deserves some time. But I wanted to show also some of the ways that, for example, Quentin worked on a more intimate scale. One of his most innovative compositional approaches was to use very kind of constrained interiors, kind of tight spaces as the setting for subjects, various subjects. So sometimes there are themes like this one that are centered on the perils of avarice, of greed. We see the moneylender and his wife counting their coins, this wonderful rendering of the different materials of all these objects. And again, this kind of narrow space in which they're seated, so we see the wood interior behind them and the shelves. This idea actually was very effective, and so he uses it also for portraits. So from Metzius, the humanist author Erasmus of Rotterdam, on the left here, commissioned his portrait and that of his friend Peter Gillis, Petrus Achilles, another Antwerp humanist. This means that the paintings were intended to be seen in proximity, and the shelves of these with the bookshelves lined up, making one continuous scene. This is probably really quite fabulous idea at the time. And the commission was intended and was in fact given as a gift to the statesman in England, Sir Thomas More, who was a close friend of both Gillis and Erasmus. This idea, which is taking place also in Italy, but was found to be a very sort of stimulating approach in the north, both in Antwerp and also something that later Hans Holbein the Younger would pick up, showing scholars at work in their offices, essentially. So these are not royalty. These are not people who are merchants of great wealth who are aspiring to other ranks, but in fact, very important intellectuals of the period. Erasmus was very pleased with his portrait in his painting, and he also commissioned a portrait medal from Metzius. And so we see that here. This was in the exhibition about Hans Holbein the Younger here at the Getty a few years ago. By the 1520s, which is the time that Metzius is working on the Getty painting, he had become one of the city's leading painters. And we know from Albert Dürer, who again had visited the Netherlands in 1520-21 and spent time in Antwerp, getting to know some of its citizens as painters. He was very keen to meet Metzius and see his home. Unfortunately, Dürer's very interesting diary doesn't actually mention that he met Metzius, but we must assume that he did. And Hans Holbein the Younger, who is still a very young artist, also very probably met Metzius when he stopped in Antwerp during his journey from Basel to England at the urging of Erasmus. There's still very intriguing questions, which are outside the scope of our time today, about the impact that Metzius had on Holbein at this time when he entered, Antwerp's circle of painters and humanists, and it's the city's thriving art market. Also in the early 1520s, Metzius was collaborating with some of his fellow painters. This is an important phenomena that really takes off in the next century, in the 17th century. But some of the foundations for these artistic partnerships happens now. Here we see him working with the landscape specialist Joachim Patinir. Patinir introduced the world view landscape of sweeping vistas seen from a high vantage, often articulated with rock formations that were inspired by the rocks that he saw in the region of Dinant. And here in the scene, Metzius contributed the figures of St. Anthony, who's being tormented by female demons. I think it's rather wonderful that instead of showing her with an actual tail, he turned her gown into sort of a tail with its little claws. This painting actually is signed by Patinir, but not by Metzius, but it's a dual authorship in the importance of the fact that you have these two leading specialists in Antwerp making it is recorded in the very first Spanish inventories and enters the Spanish royal inventories at the end of the century, and both painters are mentioned there by name. And Metzius was also attuned to themes that were particularly associated with the city of Antwerp. And amongst the artistic productions that must have been a regular sight at the city's Pans were depictions of the three magi adoring the Christ child. The gathering of the magi from the three regions of the world, accompanied by their retinues and bearing costly gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to honor the Savior, resonated with Antwerp's mercantile patrons. In keeping with taste for this theme in the late 20s, we see Metzius's really over-the-top, sort of ornamental version. And here, the figures really crowd around the Virgin and Child. And their proximity to the viewer, to us, facilitates scrutiny of the lavish metalwork and richly colored costumes. Metzius's very sensitive portrayal of the Black King and his attendants has been much remarked upon, and it's evidence further that we know of the presence of Africans in Antwerp in this period. Some of them were enslaved people, and some were perhaps coming from different regions under their own means. It's an area of research that's ongoing now. But Metzius obviously represents individuals here in his painting. A significant portion also of Metzius's output centered on paintings for private devotion. These two panels are a great example of the very popular subject of the Virgin and Christ. This pairing in the Prado, in Antwerp, are no longer physically connected, but they were a diptych, and so you would have had the two figures facing each other with the Virgin praying. They exemplify the artist's luminous color palette, and you can appreciate, I think, also his varied brushwork, this beautiful sort of diaphanous veil worn by the Virgin, and also the great precision of certain details, notably eyelashes, and this is also very clear in the jewels, so both the elaborate crown worn by the Virgin and the morse that's at the center of the top of Christ's cloak. The Getty's Christ is a Man of Sorrows also was part of this very important group of paintings, which, frankly could have been sold on the open market and probably intended to appeal to various buyers. And this is a work that also shows a great range of brushwork. If you have the chance to see it in the galleries, it's really interesting to look at the way that the yellow radiance is done with this kind of dry brush that drags out the pigment and gives it different areas of thickness and luminosity. This extremely carefully thought out and vicious crown of thorns, which has light falling on it and sort of articulating all of its different parts. The rendering of Christ's face is very moving, the tears that fall down his cheeks, and the proximity really of the figure, similar to the works that we've seen before, which is really intended to help the viewer connect very personally and directly to the Passion of Christ and to meditate upon his suffering. In the 1520s, Metzius developed a group of particularly beautiful images of the Virgin and with the Christ child, in which precious materials, and his very skillful handling of these emerging genres of still life and landscape enhance the content of the subjects. He's really modernizing the native pictorial traditions of Jan van Eyck, Hugo van der Goes, Dirk Bouts, and Rogier van der Weyden from the previous century. Here we see the Virgin Mary full length as she embraces the Christ child while seated on a stone throne flanked by marble columns. A verdant landscape, and this is a Metzius landscape, not a Patineresque landscape, extends beyond on either side of the throne, really minutely detailed setting. And you'll notice that there are these very characteristic spindly trees with these long trunks and the little broccoli tops that are very similar to the Madonna of the Cherries trees. The central placement of the enthroned holy figures in this very richly detailed setting does reference these works from a century earlier by Jan van Eyck. And I wanted to show you just some examples of what those looked like. These are somewhat smaller, but you can see also the central placement of the throne in this well-decorated room with a view out over, in this case, a cityscape. This is a slightly different theme within the Virgin and Child group, but a similar idea where we see the Virgin and Child from a distance, accompanied by important objects that sort of support the theme with their symbolism and their references to the Passion of Christ. But what a difference Metzius makes with this work, which is truly a glamorous and kind of spectacular image. We do see, as in the earlier works, the Virgin and Child from a distance, unobstructed and from the front. However, Metzius very intriguingly inserts into the foreground, set at an angle so it doesn't really impede our access to the holy figures, a remarkable still life. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. So the bread is a reference to the Eucharist. There is an apple here, tucked in there. And in fact, many of you may have spotted the cherries here nestled in the center. And this is a butter sculpture. So butter, sort of an important food, but also one that was not inexpensive and was often shown kind of in a decorative way. You could shave it, or you could, as in this case, kind of sculpt it. So it appears that the Virgin and Child are having a meal, but in fact it's a very kind of symbolic meal. And I think one of the things that you can see in this detail is this isn't just any old white cloth, but it has this pattern on it, this diamond pattern. And then Metzius has really thought about the materials and the structure of this mobile table. This is the detail from the banana, the cherries of the still life in the foreground, which I think actually, now that I had been thinking a little bit more about the Berlin painting, maybe the wooden surface that we see that at the very forefront of the Getty painting is in fact a table like that. And it gives you a chance to see that, that it's an apple here on the left. Although some have argued that it could be a pear, but I think it's intended to be an apple, which refers to the fall of man and also to Christ's role as the new Adam. and these really remarkable grapes that have Eucharistic significance also. So in this painting, Metzius revised the placement and the role of the still life. The unblemished fruit invites our scrutiny, but the arrangement on its wooden support firmly and completely prevents our entrance into the room and from any further proximity to the Virgin and Child. The spectacular settings and accoutrements in the scenes of the Virgin and Child frame and honor the tender bond between mother and child. Among Metzius's achievements was the rethinking of the popular and meaningful affectionate virgin theme, the Glycophilusa. The portrayal of a profound and intimacy and humanity of the mother and child bond through their cheek-to-cheek embrace references the ancient and much revered theme, which was known pictorially through Italo-Byzantine models, notably the work in the upper left, the Cambrai, so-called Cambrai Madonna, which was brought from Italy to Northern Europe in 1440. This incredibly important, meaningful work was extremely influential, and it was transformed, formally at least and stylistically, by Dirk Bouts into a more naturalistic mode. And I'm showing this very beautiful, rather small painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you see the Christ child looks much more like an actual child, and the Virgin is pressing him to her body, and his arm has gone around her neck. So in the Getty painting, Metzius pays homage to his illustrious contemporary Herod David and his development of this theme, in which the Christ child, with his tight blonde curls, holds his mother with both arms, with his arm around her neck. She emphasizes his corporeality with the pressure of her fingers in his soft flesh. So if you look here, there are these indentations. Herod David worked in Bruges, but he joined the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke in 1515, presumably in order to sell his works in its vibrant marketplace for luxury arts. I think it's actually highly likely that Metzius knew this particular composition, which is a late work by David, who died in 1523. Here, David innovatively situated the Holy Family in a contemporary Flemish interior. Joseph, on the right, holds a wooden bowl of milk soup, right here, with its little spoon. David's smaller panel invites a direct and personal relationship with the Holy Family, which was really the first sort of nuclear family. Whereas the Getty Metzius sort of expands on this idea to a sort of celestial setting, a much more luxurious celestial setting. But Metzius also took the idea of this domestic interior to mind. This is one of his best-known works, an extremely beautiful painting in the Louvre, where we see the Virgin and Child in a clearly domestic setting with the bed behind them and this view out over a mountainous landscape. And it's probably painted after the Getty painting. But again, Metzius uses this tabletop to separate the holy figures from the viewer, and on it he has placed the still life. So this splendid setting in the Madonna of the Cherries is certainly an interior, but it's not a domestic space, as I was saying. The Virgin and Child are not at home, but they are in fact in heaven, and everything about this setting alludes to the beauty of this celestial location. Actually, let's look at this. The intensely hued blue curtains that surround the throne and they fold over the arm of the throne here. The seat is adorned with lavish foliate tracery, large cut gemstones, and pearls. I think, although I'm open to other suggestions, that this figure here is possibly St. John the Baptist holding a candlestick without the candle. Let's see. From the oblique angle, we may admire the spectacular marbles that comprise the back and side of the throne. As we've already seen, Metzius frequently portrayed marble, agate, and other types of stone in his devotional paintings. He was unusually attentive to rendering the specific qualities of these materials: translucency, opacity, and shininess. His fondness for columns, for example, in the Berlin Madonna Enthroned, where the curved shape highlights the smooth translucence of the stone, recurs here in the architecture of the throne, at the end of the arm and on the left behind the Virgin. The capital of the latter combines an antique style capital with a kneeling figure holding a candlestick that seems more Gothic in character. These columns may refer to the future Passion of Christ, to his flagellation at the column. Metzius's precise rendering of marble signifies the fascination with the material held in this period, when it was thought to be both a rock and a gem, a substance of both the earth and the heavens. An expensive, rare, and imported material, marble signified status and power, but its properties, its color, transparency, and radiance, metaphorically connected it to sacred spaces and subjects. According to the scientific understanding in this pre-modern period, different marbles were the product of different elements. The transparency of alabaster meant that it was comprised as a solid form of air. Cipollino, a greenish marble with wavy veining, perhaps this is Cipollino marble, were associated with water. Marbles were considered organic, living things that grew, in fact, which I think is fascinating. Certain types of marble, the ones that are more reddish in tonality, were considered animalistic and display veins. The stones that Metzius displays here have elicited a lot of really interesting comments in the gallery. And I've heard over and over that the back and the sides of the throne, for some viewers, really represent a cross-section of flesh. I thought I'd give you an up-close view of this beautiful scene out the window, which helps us also understand that we're in a heavenly realm, that this is a space in which the figures are elevated above the earth. And we're looking at a really intriguing building. I'm not sure it's something specific, but it seems to be Romanesque palace or perhaps a monastic group of buildings or convent. Another important feature of the Madonna of the Cherries, signature aspect of Metzius's personal style, and I have to say one that was really particularly appreciated by contemporaries, are references to the work of Leonardo da Vinci. We see this in the manner here, particularly in the way that the Virgin's flesh, and especially the Christ child, are modeled with this kind of warm brown sfumato modeling. In fact, the theme of the Virgin and Child with Cherries is derived from a Leonardesque painting, which is unfortunately now lost, but has been transmitted through many followers and many versions. John Pietrino conveyed Leonardo's compositional types through different iterations of this painting, although it's not clear that the specific composition was known to Quentin Metzius. However, he was certainly familiar with fellow Antwerp painter Jos van Cleef's compositions. So it appears in the 1520s that there was a major taste for Leonardesque ideas in Antwerp. And how Metzius was familiar with them is somewhat unclear, but he was very engaged with certain ideas that had come out of Leonardo's studio, particularly grotesque heads. And we see some of them used in paintings like this one, multi-figure works, for example, the Kneeling Magi in the foreground, where we have this exaggerated physiognomy and expression. It also spurred his satirical portrait, which is today in the London National Gallery, known as The Ugly Duchess. It portrays a woman dressed in aristocratic but out-of-date clothing. Her features, including her hairy mole, are emphasized. The work is intended as an embodiment of vanity. This woman is intent on seduction. She's holding a wilted rosebud. And it was a pendant to another work that's in a private collection, a profile portrait of a man. As far as we know, Metzius did not travel to Italy himself, but it seems that he had access to copy drawings, perhaps brought back by colleagues from their own travels. And one of those drawings, or a drawing similar to it, is this one in the Royal Collection. This one has been attributed to Leonardo's pupil and heir, Francesco Melzi. This is a really intriguing aspect of his work, and much more research is needed here until we understand a bit better how these ideas were transmitted. The Madonna of the Cherries was a really successful composition, and the artist, with the help of his studio, generated numerous versions. Until the present painting at the Getty resurfaced only a few years ago, Metzius's Madonna of the Cherries was known from other treatments by the artist and his studio, the most important of which is this piece today on view in Mauritshuis. It has an illustrious provenance. It comes from the Dutch Royal Collection, but it's very different, at least in the accoutrements, than the Getty painting. And you can see here that he's created a different throne, which has a cloth of honor at the back, and its architecture is a little bit more elaborate with this gold architectural detailing. And also, the fruit is reversed order. So if you are looking for clues about what's what, you can check the fruit as well. Just quickly show you other versions. This is one that's closer to the Getty painting by the Quentin Metzius studio. It was not uncommon for artists to generate multiple versions of a composition, and while it's possible that Metzius devised the Madonna of the Cherries for a specific patron who desired a relatively large devotional painting, perhaps for a private chapel, we have no documentary evidence that this was the case. It's more likely that the artist painted this work as the prime version and developed variants distinguished by alternative details, as we've seen, rearrangement of the foreground fruit and variations in the throne decoration. The relatively minimal underdrawings found in the Getty painting, visible using infrared reflectography, is relatively cursory and without substantial compositional changes between the preparatory drawing and the paint layer. And this suggests that Metzius may have used a separate drawing as its basis. My colleagues and I will investigate the genesis of the Getty painting and its materials in an upcoming technical study. However, the Madonna of the Cherries and its variants point to a desire for luxurious paintings from Antwerp in an identifiable high style by one of its leading practitioners. And I think that they were also important in their association with Antwerp because of their focus on the Virgin. The Madonna of the Cherries survives the religious upheavals in the Netherlands in the late 16th century, during which Antwerp shifted from its being a huge bustling center of trade, populated by a myriad of nationalities, to a Calvinist stronghold, and finally a Catholic bastion, part of the southern Netherlands, a crucial region in the Habsburg Empire. It probably remained in Antwerp during that period. In the late 16th century, long after Metzius's death, his reputation continued to grow, and among the paintings sold in the city were a significant number of forgeries of Metzius's compositions. The Joiners Guild Alt Triptych had been saved from the attack in August 1566 by iconoclasts. This was a tremendously destructive event across the Netherlands, which in Antwerp really had a profound effect on art, paintings and sculpture. It was destructive riots that were fueled by terrible economic circumstances, immense frustration with the Spanish king, Philip II, and also Protestant itinerant preachers who were speaking to large crowds outside the city. And during this time, the churches of Antwerp, their interiors were badly damaged, and numerous sculptures and paintings were lost. But this triptych survived, and it was also then saved subsequently from being sold abroad, first to the Spanish king in Madrid, Philip II, and then later saved from England's Queen Elizabeth I, thanks to the efforts of the Dean of the Painters Guild, Martin de Vos. Antwerp's city magistrates acquired the altarpiece for their chapel in the Cathedral of Our Lady, where it decorated the altar. By the early 17th century, the Madonna of the Cherries had entered the safe and enthusiastic hands of one of Antwerp's leading collectors, Cornelis van der Geest. Van der Geest was a wealthy and cultured spice merchant with a large home adjacent to the wharves on the Scheldt River. The painter Peter Paul Rubens described him, quote, as the best of men and my oldest friend, who since my youth has been my never-failing patron, whose whole life showed a love and admiration of painting, quote. Here he's portrayed, Van der Geest is portrayed by Anthony van Dyck, who I think really captures this kind of intense intellectual kind of interiority of the sitter, a very pious and charitable man who was well known throughout Antwerp. The brushwork in this painting is amazing. It makes it seem extremely alive, captures the light on the moisture in his eyes, for example. And we see a slight turn in Van der Geest's body, as if he's pivoting to sort of engage us. For connoisseurs and artists in the early 17th century, Metzeis was considered the founder of the Antwerp school. And so Van der Geest and Rubens, for example, among others, were real Metzeis aficionados. We are reminded of this transformation from manual artist to painter with the publication of the biography 1610. We see the portrait known from 1572, but here it's been combined with a scene of a blacksmith's forge in the background just to drive home that sort of first phase of his life, or at least according to the legend. A few decades later, the significance of this early 16th century artist continued to resonate, leading to the publication of two biographies by Francois Ficart and Alexander van Voornenburg. In their accounts, Ficart and Voornenburg elaborate on the artist's life, but they also shed light on the pivotal role played by the Madonna of the Cherries. The painting was at the center of a momentous exchange when the owner, Van der Geest, Cornelis van der Geest, received the rulers of the Son of the Netherlands, Archduke Albert and Isabel Clara Eugenia, at his home in August 1615 and showed them his art collection. The events on that day were portrayed 13 years later in an extraordinary rendering by Willem van Haag, who was not only a skilled painter, but was the curator of Van der Geest's collection. Van Haag's splendid view is part of a genre of Flemish paintings known as collectors' cabinets, in which we see art lovers studying, discussing, and exploring a collector's holdings of paintings, drawings, and sculpture, as well as jewels, antique sculpture and casts, watches, and extraordinary wonders from the natural world, such as coral and shells. It really provides a compendium of the remarkable works in Van der Geest's collection. And here we have the most distinguished visitors examining these paintings and other works. At the center is Van der Geest himself, who's showing the Archdukes Isabel and Albert his most prized painting, the Madonna of the Cherries, right here. We can be certain that Van der Geest's painting is the Madonna of the Cherries today at the Getty. The work we've been discussing today is of very high quality, and Van Haag rendered Van der Geest's painting in such detail that we can compare the two. As Cornelis van der Geest's curator, Van Haag knew the contents of his collection extremely well, and he rendered this small work with great care and close observation. Gathered on the right-hand side of Van der Geest's gallery, we can see a number of important painters. We won't identify everybody, but over here in this group, you have Frans Snijders, the still life painter, Jan Wildens, the landscape painter, and Hendrik van Balen. And on the right, we can see the Archduke and Duchess. So this is Isabel and Archduke Albert. Rubens, who was a court painter, is explaining or whispering important facts about the Metzeis painting to Archduke Albert. This is Ladislas Sigismund Vasa of Poland, the painter Antony van Dyck, various dignitaries, including the former mayor of Antwerp, Nicola Rocox, and then, of course, Van der Geest here. Van der Geest's home would have had to be truly palatial to have accommodated such a dense display of art. Instead of a realistic snapshot of a gallery, Van Hacht visualizes the collection as a whole. In his portrayal, he not only conveys the scope and arrangement of the collection, which includes important Italian paintings, but among the paintings, he reinforces Metsays's position in the canon of Netherlandish painters up to the present day. While mostly identifiable, not all of the paintings have been located today, but I thought I would mention a couple that are known. For those of you interested in Jan van Eyck, this is a lost work of a woman bathing, so I encourage you to take a good look, and just in case you happen to encounter it. you would be feted with by every art historian I can think of. A second work by Metsays was in this collection, this wonderful portrait of a scholar today in Frankfurt. This is Jan Wilden's Hunters in the Snow, which is today in Dresden. And on the back wall, we have Rubens's portrait of the Dr. Paracelsus, which is based actually on a Metsays portrait of the doctor. That's here. And then Rubens's Battle of the Amazons. The idea, I think, that's very interesting is that we have sort of lined up here this sort of direct connection between sort of Rubens as the kind of inheritor of Metsays's fame and sort of leadership of the Antwerp school. So as we see it here, the exchange between the collector and host and his distinguished guests is poised at a moment of delight and respect. However, the visit would soon deteriorate. The archdukes, like Philip II of Spain, who was Isabella's father and Albert's uncle, were keenly interested in obtaining early Flemish devotional paintings. In 1615, during their visit to the collection, they desired the centerpiece of Van der Geest's collection, the Madonna of the Cherries, for themselves. In general, the archdukes were well liked and respected among elite circles. And in the religio-political system of governance of the southern Netherlands, presumably there would usually have been little impediment to granting their wishes. Although he wasn't a member of the Brussels court, Van der Geest would have understood the potential advantages to acquiescing and earning royal favor. However, Van der Geest refused to part with his prized Metsays. The biographers Vickert and Vorneberg reported the incident with glee, but not the consequences, if any, for Van der Geest. By the time this scene was painted, Archduke Albert had passed away, and Archduchess Isabel was governing the region alone, but relying on Rubens for successful diplomatic efforts. At his death in 1638, the Madonna of the Cherries passed to Van der Geest's nephew, Cornelis de Licht, who lived in Antwerp, and de Licht sold it, probably that year, to the cloth merchant and collector Peter Stevens, who was a warden of Antwerp Cathedral. At his death in 1668, the painting was sold by his heirs in 1668 as Quentin Metsays, a very celebrated piece of the Virgin Mary. 475 years after this 1668 sale, nothing is known about the whereabouts of Metsays's Madonna of the Cherries. By 1840, it had entered the collection of the Comte of Franqueville at Château de la Muette in Passy, and it was sold from that estate in 1920 to Madame Darcy in Paris. The black and white reproduction of the painting in the 1920 sales catalog, however, reveals that some interventions had taken place. Most obviously, a semi-transparent curtain screened out the landscape, and the figures seem heavier and thicker. When the painting appeared at auction in 2015, these aspects were evident and effectively served to disguise the quality of the painting. We can't know for sure when these alterations occurred, but I suspect that it may have been during the mid-19th century. The momentum of collecting early Flemish paintings, and even familiarity with Metsays himself, had yet to transpire. as would soon be the case around 1900, with significant exhibitions and publications dealing with paintings from 15th and early 16th century Bruges and Antwerp. I think perhaps the style and visual impact of the Madonna of the Cherries was at odds with a very different taste at the time. And so here, a restorer, another artist was brought in to tone it down, essentially to rein it back. The painting remained quietly in France through the 20th century. And when it emerged on the London art market, covered, as you see here, with a very discolored brownish varnish and the curtain, there was cautious appreciation for certain aspects of its quality. But the discolored varnish, the thick bodies, they all seemed to suggest that this was not Van der Heest's Madonna of the Cherries, despite its adherence in the details to Van Hack's small reproduction. And it was sold in 2015 as Studio of Quentin Metsys. However, the private buyer took a chance. A private buyer took a chance at the sale, and he had faith that the painting could look different. It was cleaned by the new owner, and when it returned to the London art market last summer, with the removal of varnish and the disfiguring curtain and other additions, it revealed a painting in a remarkable condition. Particularly notable are the subtle areas of warm modeling in the flesh and survival of the tiniest details, such as the swan on the lake, and there was also a little tiny windmill, which really allow for full appreciation of Metsys's varied technique and bold color effects. On a personal note, it's been extremely exciting to finally locate a painting I've known from my early training as an intriguing lost masterpiece. One of my classmates at the Courtauld, Marie-Isabelle Poussin-Smith, presented a wonderful paper in our seminar about the mythology of Quentin Metsys, the blacksmith painter, which subsequently, in 2001, became a key article in defining the artist's status. I'm still thrilled to see this painting in the North Pavilion. Very excitingly, we've reunited it with Gerard David's moving and influential Holy Family, underscoring the artistic connections between Flemish painters and the potent visual language of exquisite beauty and expressive emotion that brought by Metsys and David to the early 16th century. So I encourage you to see the paintings for yourself in Gallery N202. For those who are interested in Quentin Metsys, there are many works that we can't cover, of course, today. So a new catalog is underway, which should be out in a few years. And there are plans to celebrate the 500th anniversary of his death, astonishing, in 2030 in Antwerp with an exhibition. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
And
So I'm
we have a
happy
few
to take
time.
questions.
We have a few time for a couple questions. I just will open with one from a webinar, and I think you addressed this, but someone asked, curious about the throne in the Madonna painting. A mythical being tops the throne, and I wonder if this being has been identified. Was it just a random decorative element, or did it have a special meaning to Metsys? Could this throne have been a real one that Metsys observed somewhere?
Great, thank you so much for the question. And yeah, the throne is absolutely fascinating. I do think it's a fantastical construction. I think that he combined the elements that he needed to define this celestial space and the sort of status of the holy figures. This decoration here is the figure that I think could be St. John the Baptist, who's holding an empty candlestick. But I'm still thinking about what that could be. What I find fascinating is that it's combined with a sort of pseudo-antique Gothic or pseudo-antique capital to the marble column. So you have a sort of a double decoration there.
Great. You mentioned the term for an intimate scene between Madonna and child. What is this category type called?
So the affectionate virgin type, I think maybe is what the question is addressing. It's called a glycophilusa, a type that emerges in late, Italo-Byzantine painting, showing the Virgin and Child in an affectionate embrace.
The enthroned Madonna is shaped oddly. Does this background reflect how it was installed? The enthroned Madonna?
Well, yes, I mean, it's rather fascinating because the throne is at a slightly oblique angle to us. So Metzius is kind of showing us multiple views in one sort of construction. So we are seeing the throne in part from the side, from here, but then the figure, of course, is at an angle to us and is the back of the throne a little bit.
Are there any questions here in the audience? Yes.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in the Pont markets that you were talking about. What are the records like for sales within those spaces? Are they widely digitized? Do you have to go to the various towns where those things were sold? Or is it kind of a if you know thing? What is that process like as a researcher?
So I am grateful to the researcher of Dan Ewing, who published on the Antwerp Pont. He accessed the financial registers, or what survive, and I think they're preserved in the Cathedral Archive, if I'm not mistaken. So I think they can still be consulted. His Art Bulletin article is the source for sort of connecting it to the church and to the church's oversight and kind of development of the economic prospects of the Pont. But as I said, there were, various records in Antwerp were lost in various fires and things, so, it's not so surprising that we don't have more specific and personal information. Of course, we'd love to know precisely who was there. But yeah, there definitely is a great deal of information in them, so I can refer you to that piece. And then it's a complicated history because I think there's a new Bourse, a new Antwerp Exchange, which opens up. So this Our Lady's Pont stops functioning around 1560. Then there's a bigger arcaded building in a different location that's run differently. And so there's sort of a handoff for the remaining period of time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions in the audience? This gentleman here.
Thank you. Hi, I had a quick question about one of the versions of the Madonna of the cherries, where the throne was sort of more ornate. Mm-hmm. At the top of it, there was a scallop shell.
Yeah.
Which is usually associated with Venus. Mm. I'm wondering if there's some kind of connection or what the scallop shell might signify.
It's an interesting question. I think a little bit like here, where you have a sort of insertion of something from the antique, you have a sort of a form that probably comes out of sort of an antique source that he was aware of that creates, because actually that whole throne has a kind of wavy, interesting kind of shell-like quality to it, even though it's a marble seat. So it kind of operates as a visual substitute for a sort of crowning element almost. Certainly makes a very rich and very impactful architectural statement, then combined with that green and gold cloth of honor. But I think not necessarily meant to connect per se to the mythological goddess.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, Anne. Please go see the please go see the work, which is on the second floor in North Pavilion. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.